On today's episode, we are talking about how to start a podcast of your own. We're not just going to be covering the basics like what mic to choose and which hosting platform. We're going to be covering a lot of details that are going to be unique to any other content you're consuming about how to start a podcast. In fact, if there's one mission that I have for today's episode is that if you are looking to start a podcast, that after today's episode, you will never Google search how to start a podcast again. Because the good news is that there's barely anything to it. There's a few things that you're going to want to know to get off to a fast start, and that's why I'm breaking up the topic into actually 2 episodes. So this first one on how to start a podcast, and then we've got the second episode coming out later this week on how to grow a podcast. And you're certainly going to want to subscribe if you want the information in that episode, because how I've grown my podcast is a way that a lot of people aren't talking about online. And I honestly think that it's the easiest and most effective way to grow a podcast right from the start. When I started my podcast at the beginning of 2019, I was able to gain about 1,000 subscribers in just a couple months, and it really wasn't hard if you apply the strategies that I'm going to teach you in the next episode. So be sure to subscribe if you want to look out for that. Otherwise, in today's episode on how to start a podcast, we're going to be covering a little bit of why you might want to, and especially for 2022, and all the details on how to actually do it. But I will tell you now, the last information that I'm going to give you in this episode will be the most important key and the reason why so many people want to start a podcast and never do. That is not going to be you. You have found the right episode. So before we get into how to actually do it, let's talk about 3 unique reasons why it might be a good idea for you to do. The first reason is because when you have a podcast, it lets you talk to so many new people using the podcast as leverage. There are so many 7-figure entrepreneurs that I've had on my own podcast simply because I can message them and say, hey, would you like to come on my show? It's a means that I've kind of been able to get free business coaching. Some of these entrepreneurs would have charged me a few hundred, if not $1,000 to speak to them for an hour, but because I had an audience that I could invite them onto, it makes it worth it for them. We actually had someone on my own podcast named Dr. Judy Ho, and she started her own podcast, and her first episode was interviewing Mark Cuban. So just by having a podcast, you now have leverage to talk to so many people in the world, especially in your market. We also had Hala Taha that I interviewed on my show, and she's interviewed Matthew McConaughey before. And they don't ask about download numbers. So even if you have a small podcast, they won't know. This is not public information, or they'd really have to dig around to find how many downloads a podcast is getting. But for the most part, just inviting them onto a podcast to come speak about their experience is enough for a ton of people to choose to do it. The second reason is because there is a major advantage that podcasts have over pretty much any other social media. When people listen to a podcast, they are usually walking their dog, they are driving their car, they are working out, they're doing chores. They're already occupied by doing some other little task, but they're mostly giving their attention to the audio that they're listening to. Unlike when people watch YouTube videos on their computer, a lot of times they also have their phone up. Even when people watch TV, they also have their phone up. They are trying to do 2 things at once. When people are on Instagram, they are just scrolling between post after post. And to get their attention span for a long time is really hard to do. It's pretty rare that people even watch 40-minute YouTube videos, but they are very likely to listen to 40-minute podcast episodes. And from a marketing standpoint, when you have people's full attention, obviously it's going to be a lot easier to have them get to know you better, as well as promote your offers in full detail and really get a chance to teach information properly. The third reason is simply because audio is just what you want to do. I think the main reason that someone should choose any social media platform that you want to be on for your business is because that style of content creation is in line with your skill set and what you want to do. When it comes down to, should I start a podcast or a YouTube or Instagram? Like, which one is, saturated? Which one has too many people? Right now, at this point in time, going into 2022, all of the social media platforms that are going to be relevant next year, at least that we know of right now, are in their stages of maturity. Even TikTok has crossed the threshold from no longer being a new app and really getting their user base expanded to the older generations as well. So more so, it's where does your content fit the most? Where can you provide the most value? And where are your potential customers hanging out is so much more how you're going to choose which platform you should be on. And then why you would choose a podcast over some other types of content is just simply because audio is your preferred style of communication, and it's where you can shine the best. So if you are someone who likes to do more long form content, if you like to kind of go off on tangents like I really do, and you like to explain your points in full detail, podcasting is just a general good place to do it. It's cool that you don't have to get dressed up to record a podcast. You don't have to have a camera. You don't have to have lights. You don't have to be good on camera. You don't have to know video editing to do a podcast. So if that's more in line with your skill set and you don't want to learn those things, then starting a podcast over a YouTube channel would be a good idea. Don't look at it like, oh, is a podcast or YouTube a better idea? It's, do you want to do video or do you want to do audio is really the question there. So more look at it like, is my skill set and the way that I deliver content and the way that I want to, because this is something that you're ideally going to do for years, what's going to be the easiest for you to consistently show up for? And for me, I just love podcasting. I love just coming on the mic without a designated script, and then just the ability to correct myself and redo parts very easily. And it's just very easy to, get down. There's a lot less skill sets needed than if you were to go on Instagram and need to learn Canva and graphic design. But if you know graphic design, then that should come into play with where you ultimately grow. But in regards to podcasting, you would choose it because you like that style of content and you want to do audio. It fits your skill set. Don't look into it too much further. You don't have to be like, are podcasts still good? Is it too late in the game to get started? All I'd say about that is like 95% of people who want to start a podcast have that thought that, oh, it's probably too late to start anyways. And that keeps most of them from doing it. So because of that, it will never really be too saturated because so few people ever even start their podcast. So don't worry about like which platform is the best or whatever. It's which platform is best for you, because wherever you can provide the most value is where you're going to do the best. So choose a podcast for that reason. So now that we've got the why covered, let's talk about the actual how, starting with your hosting platform. You've probably debated some of the major options out there, such as Anchor, BuzzSprout, Libsyn, Podbean, and I'm going to give you my take on why I wish I would have done it a different way. I did start on Anchor. I am on BuzzSprout now. And even though the redirect process is pretty easy to switch from one feed to another, there's actually some things that were lost during that time. So for those of you watching with me on video, I'm going to show you some stats here, but I will describe them as best as I can to those of you on audio. So I'm in my Anchor platform here, and I haven't been on Anchor for pretty much exactly 1 year now. The podcast had 2 years on Anchor, and now it's had 1 year on Buzzsprout. I switched at the end of October 2020. Now, something else I'll mention is I actually, at the time that I switched from hosting on Anchor over to Buzzsprout, I also changed the name of the podcast. So that has to play in a little bit to some of the metrics we'll go over of why some of my numbers went down during that time when I was switching names of the podcast. And I'll give you my 2 cents on that, mostly just so you understand why you probably would want to start on the platform that you plan to finish on. Anchor has such a pull, or it anchors people in because it is a free platform. And the great thing about it is that you can do basic audio editing in here. You can't really, get rid of like background noise and stuff like that. It doesn't do that. And then the other cool thing is that it's easy to find sponsors. The only problem with it is that it's not on you to find the sponsors, which is also kind of cool, but like they go out and find you sponsors. If you're watching with me on video here, you can see these are some of the sponsors that I've had over time. Made a few $100 from a lot of these. but I basically ran ads in the middle of my episodes, my biggest supporter being Anchor themselves, Anchor paying me to run ads promoting Anchor in my earlier podcast. And it was really cool that it made it super easy to get ads going. And it wasn't a ton of money, but I earned about $5,500 in the 2 years that I was running ads through Anchor because Anchor does middleman the ads. That's where they're making their money because it is a free platform. But a lot of people that run ads on their show eventually don't want to be on Anchor. They want to find the sponsors themselves just so they can get paid directly from the company and receive 100% of the advertising payment by setting up these deals themselves. That just makes it so you have an extra job where you have to go out and find these advertisers. I don't run ads on my podcast anymore. I did in the early days because, as I'll kind of detail later in the episode, when I first started the podcast, I actually had no means of making money in mind. I just was putting it out because I wanted to get started and then just see where it went. But because I didn't have products to sell, I didn't have digital courses or coaching programs yet, it was nice to be able to monetize quickly with ads. But once you get to a point, if you're a business that sells enough of your own stuff, it's kind of better to just rule out not doing ads, or at least in my opinion. It depends on how the numbers are, of course. Like if I could make over 10 or 15 or 20 grand a year from it, I would probably still allow them, but it is also helpful to not have ads if you have a bunch of your own stuff to sell, just so you're not like double promoting all the time. You're like, oh, go buy from this other company. Oh, and buy from mine. So I personally, that's why I don't run ads anymore, and partly why I didn't, it wasn't an issue for me to leave Anchor. By the end of my relationship with Anchor too, they were sending me so many advertisers at the beginning to work with. Like every couple weeks, I was getting a new one. It was awesome. I was like, this is the best thing ever. And then the last probably like 4 months with them, they didn't send me a single one. And I had ads running on my podcast that I wasn't even getting paid for. It was annoying because they were like, yeah, the promotion ended. We're no longer paying you on it. However, the audio was still in the episode. So basically how it works is wherever you create your podcast, whether that be Anchor or any of the other platforms, or I'm just basically going to categorize it into there's Anchor and then there's everything else. There's the free one and then the free all-in-one app, which is Anchor, and then the normal hosting platforms, which I use BuzzSprout now, which I'll show you the back end of that in a second. So the RSS feed was created in Anchor. And then when I had to do a redirect, now everything is being redirected from Anchor over to BuzzSprout. But as you can see here, looking at my podcast performance since I switched over, there are still a couple hundred or, between 50 and 100 plays every single week that is getting counted in Anchor and not getting counted in BuzzSprout. And I have no idea how to get to collect those extra plays over on my new hosting platform. So somehow it still looks like not everything going through the RSS feed is still coming through to BuzzSprout, but you lose most of the data when you're working with Anchor. So eventually I switched it over to BuzzSprout, but look at all the extra data that you get. When you're in BuzzSprout, you get to see not that much more than Anchor by itself. However, you get to use all of these other podcasting stats provided from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Stitcher. You actually have access to the portals in each of these, and that has some cool data. So here's like Google Podcasts, which gives me a hard subscriber count. I don't have nearly as many people on Google Podcasts as Apple. And that's going to be the same with everyone. But then you can see my average watch time, which is super awesome to see because I can see like this one got 99% average play, which is awesome, 72%. And this one here has 37%. So, just kind of gives you some insight as to should I, switch up my style of that episode or what's going on here. It kind of looks like the longer episodes have shorter watch time. So just things like that is just useful to see. And the biggest issue is Apple Podcasts, which is by far where I have the most listeners. I have my podcast connected and it still won't show me the data. And the analytics in here are pretty much the best analytics that you can get, unfortunately. So I'm still trying to work this out with them. I will let you know if I get this figured out. But above all, this is probably the worst data that I'm missing from starting on Anchor and then moving to BuzzSprout later. The reason why I went with BuzzSprout in the end, apart from cost, is they have this program called Magic Mastering, and I'm not using it right now because I know how to do the audio editing of my podcast. But if you don't know how to do basic audio editing, there is a couple $1 per month upgrade that you can do using BuzzSprout, where they will audio edit the podcast for you. That doesn't like take out your ums and such like that. It just gets rid of background noise and it equalizes out the volumes. So pretty simple stuff. If you have a basic audio editing app or even like a video editing app, is probably going to have these basic audio editing tools. But otherwise, you can use the Magic Mastering for just a couple bucks a month. And that's just one other skill that you don't have to gain. So if you want to just go audio only podcast, put it on BuzzSprout, and then you can do the editing and like chopping it up on your own, but then you can do the audio mastering, as it's called, through just, this instant program. Then that's a way that you can, get that going still. Otherwise, I pay like $9 per month for BuzzSprout. And, it's really nothing. It's $108 a year. So when it comes down to saving $108 per year versus having all of your data and then owning the full rights to your podcast and not having someone middleman your advertisers, I would just start on BuzzSprout. Even if you're like, look, I don't even know what this podcast will turn into, I would still start on BuzzSprout, just because you're not going to be able to switch over as cleanly later as you would like to. And it's such a cheap cost. And when you financially commit yourself to something like this, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the gear that I'm using. And I'll also tell you at the beginning that I actually didn't use any gear at all. So it is okay to start the podcast with just your phone. It's not ideal. However, there is a lot to say about just getting started is the most important thing. So if you're like, look, I'm broke, I'm not going to be able to afford a $100 plus microphone for a couple weeks, I would just start the podcast with your phone. And what you can do, assuming you don't use the Anchor app, you can get an app called Voice Record Pro, and there's a light version of it too. And that has some basic background editing that you can do, but I would record on your phone using a professional recorder, not the voice memo app. So get like an app for voice recording that can, help you out a little bit than just the pre-loaded voice recorder app on your phone. But getting started is ultimately, the best thing that you can do in that case. If you can afford to just go get a microphone, again, it's going to help you financially commit yourself to the process. And I'll also detail the gear that I'm using to put this podcast on YouTube. But I will say that when you put your podcast on YouTube, it literally quadruples the workload. And it also requires you to have more skill set. You have to know basic video editing. You have to know how to work a camera, do lighting. So audio only is how I would recommend to start the podcast. And all you need for that is a mic and a pop filter. And the pop filter is something I wish I bought earlier, because what a pop filter does is it's just some kind of screen in between you and the mic that filters out the P word. So here is me going with the pop filter, and then without. Pop filters are only about $7 to $20, so totally worth the investment. And the mic I'm using is a Blue Yeti Caster. This is about a $200 microphone. And I'll go ahead and take my camera off the stand here so you guys can see everything that I got going on. But basically, this will come with a clamp, just kind of like this, where it goes on the desk. And the reason why I chose the Yeti Caster over the standard Yeti mic, it's really the exact same microphone. It's just as a matter of, does it have this boom arm or not? I'd rather have it be an arm that is just out of the way. So I now upgraded to this tri-arm thing that holds your mic as well as a camera and then a light. And then on the other side here, I have a ring light that is just on a very low light setting to be my fill light. So The light that I'm using here is called an Elgato Key Light Air, and I do recommend this, even just recording Instagram content, for having this type of light instead of a ring light, because this is a lot less likely to have a big, bright, shiny ring in your eyes when you use like a soft light like this. And it's just as better lighting. This tri-stand was probably like $100. This Elgato Key Light Air is $120. This ring light over here as the fill light was $40. And then the camera that I'm using is a Sony VZ1. And this is a $750 camera. Maybe you can find it slightly less on sale. And I have really loved this thing. It is a point and shoot camera. It does not have a separate lens that you need to buy, which is partly why I did it, but it is Sony's vlogger camera. It is made for filming at a desk. It's just made for just turn it on and it's ready to go. However, for a long time, I did put my podcast on YouTube using just my phone, which is totally fine. It just kind of gets annoying after a while having my phone out of commission while I was recording and getting phone calls and stuff like that. A lot of times I'd forget to turn on airplane mode. And of course, the quality is just not as good. So I was just eventually ready to upgrade. But really, you can use an iPhone, especially anything after an iPhone 10 or comparable Samsungs, and you can go into the video settings and even turn it to record in 4K and get extremely good video quality. So using a phone for getting started on YouTube is completely acceptable. It took me a very long time before I deemed it worth it to buy a nicer camera, but once I saw that it was going to be something that I was going to use all the time is when I chose to make that investment. So every piece of gear that I'm using is linked in the description. But again, I wouldn't even start your podcast on YouTube until you've got at least 10 to 20, if not 50 to 100 episodes done audio wise, unless you already have YouTube skills and or video skills. Otherwise, there's just going to be plenty for you to learn and get better at the beginning doing audio only. For that, you really just need your mic, a pop filter, and then a basic program to record on. So I would recommend, I use Camtasia myself, which is a video editor primarily, but it works for audio editing too. And that is, I'll link that as well. That's between $100 and $200 one-time fee for Camtasia. Or you could go on the computer here and use a website called Online Voice Recorder. So it's online-voice-recorder. And this will just edit out the background noise for you, and you can record on here and then you can upload it after. So this will help your audio quality a little bit. And yeah, those would be the basic programs that I would use for recording if you're looking to keep it cheap. So that's really it for gear. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Obviously, there is more expensive gear that you can get in every category that I've chose to invest in. I've really gone with the medium option in most cases, but I was able to build this whole setup for about $1,000 here for video. But really, this setup was about $220 for just audio only. So obviously, it's a lot cheaper to just do audio only too. So to conclude here, let me just go into the main point that I wanted to make. The information that at the beginning of the episode, I told you, if you only listen to my last tip today, you will be able to start a podcast no problem. So if you've been thinking about starting a podcast for a long time, you need to know that the longer you wait to start your podcast, it's kind of like standing on top of a diving board. The longer you wait there, the more irrational fears just sink in. What if I hit the water wrong and blah, 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 okay? If you just get to the top and you jump right away, how much easier is that? You don't want to wait too long. If you had to give a public speech and you were the 50th speaker out of 50, how much more nervous are you going to be than if you were like the first speaker and you could just get it out of the way? What you're doing to yourself is you're making yourself wait way too long, and all these irrational fears are creeping in. You need to start your podcast before you let them sink in any longer. And the day that I thought about starting a podcast, I was driving around and I was looking for some more information to grow my e-commerce business with Instagram. And I typed in Instagram or Instagram marketing in the Apple Podcast app. And all the podcasts that I was finding weren't really answering my questions. And a lot of them hadn't come out with episodes in months. And it looked like it was a big opportunity. I was in a position where the only way I could start it right then was if I started with my phone. So I did. And in between appointments, I'd record on my phone. I added extra background music to compensate for the extra traffic that you could hear in the background. But I came out with 3 episodes that first day of the podcast. I'll even show you here. Look, at December 30th was the first day of the podcast. 3 episodes came out that day. And then I came out with another 3 episodes a couple days later. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Basically 10. I came out with 10 episodes the first week. So if you're someone who's been researching how to start a podcast for a long time, years even, and you're back again to another video to learn that you should buy a mic and BuzzSprout's a good recommendation, you don't need any of this information, okay? You have 24 hours, in my opinion, to get this started, or you're probably just never going to do it. So, like I said, I want this to be the last how to start a podcast video you ever watch. So, if you want to start a podcast, you have 24 hours to record and publish your first episode. If you have money to go buy a mic right now, come back, record the episode, and if you don't like it, record it again. And then record it and edit again. You don't have to be good. There's so many podcasts that I come out with that I probably sound like I'm really smooth, but all I'm doing is editing out all my ums, all of my tangents that didn't make sense and I didn't really need to do. A lot of it's edited out so that I do sound smooth, and you can do that same thing. You will become a smooth speaker in the process. You will get better in the process. But until you started and come out with your first episode, none of the questions that you even have about how to start a podcast or grow it are really going to do anything for you, because you don't have anything to relate to. You don't have your specific situation going on, and you're just asking general questions, and you're getting knowledge long before it's actually time to apply it, which it means that you're just going to have to learn it again anyways once the time comes to actually execute. So if you have not started your podcast and you know you want to do it, come out with a few episodes. And if you love it, keep going. If you don't love it, then now your story can at least be, oh yeah, I came out with a podcast, I recorded a few episodes, but it wasn't really for me. I thought I'd like it, but I didn't really like it. And yeah, I'm glad I tried it. Rather than, what if I started that podcast? You'll just have a what if question forever. You're just going to have this regret. And because you're stuck on, is it too late? Or any of those other total BS thoughts that you are telling yourself of why it's too late or you're not able to do it. Who cares? If you get 5 listeners, great. Just start it, okay? Just start it, because you can't be an entrepreneur without this mentality. It is crippling you if you do not have a get it done now mentality with things that you know you should do and you know you want to do and you know would be awesome to have going on in your life. So hope to hear some awesome podcast stories. Be sure to subscribe, because in a few days I will be coming out with the how to grow a podcast episode. So come out with that first episode, and I'll see you in a couple of days. See you later.